Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff coming to you tonight from Tel Aviv, and this episode of Inside Israel, it's a little bit different. It's called Tennis 101. I'm going to tell you about the unique challenges that Israeli tennis players face. And in a moment, I'll explain why that's the topic tonight. Sort of a change from what we've been doing up until now. Real quick, want to let you know that the episode you are seeing right now, first of all, it is not the one that's going to drop on Apple and Spotify on Wednesday. On Wednesday, I have a really cool interview with Osnat Lautman. She is an expert on the Israeli personality, and she's got a couple of books out right now, one of which is an Amazon bestseller, all about how Israelis think and basically her entire career. She goes around the world working with companies in other countries, preparing them for working with Israelis. You know, Israel is huge in the tech space. So this means that Israelis are going overseas to other companies, and people from other countries are coming to Israel to work with Israelis. And there's a lot of culture shock. There's a lot of different ways of doing business. Other countries are, they tend to behave in one way, and Israelis are very different. And it's shocking. And it used to be that this would lead to business relationships falling apart. But then Osnat got involved, and her entire career is based on helping different cultures work with each other, particularly when it comes to other cultures working with Israelis. So I interviewed her all about her work and what she does. And that episode is going to drop this Wednesday morning on Apple and on Spotify. If you're not already a subscriber there, just go to joelchasnoff.com/podcast. You'll see the buttons. Click those buttons and you can subscribe to Apple and Spotify. But this episode you're hearing right now, it's only airing tonight live. And again, it'll be on my website tomorrow within 24 hours. So if you know someone who didn't catch it, they can watch the recording there. But it will not be uploaded to Apple and Spotify this Wednesday. Okay. So, Tennis 101. Why, with everything going on in Israel right now, am I talking to you about tennis? Well, the Australian Open finished today. Yannick Sinner and Madison Keys took the championships, so we got an American in there, which is awesome, winning a major. And that's one reason I want to talk to you about tennis. Also, Israel had a player there, Lena Glushko, who I mentioned in a previous podcast episode. I'll tell you a little bit about her story again. But I think there's a more global reason why I'm talking to you about Israeli tennis tonight on Inside Israel. And it's because with everything else going on, I think it's important that we talk about other aspects of Israeli life besides just the war and the IDF and Israel's PR problem and the hostages. Now, don't worry. I'm still going to address some of those issues at the end of the broadcast. We have big news this week. Naama Levy, who her brother is in one of my kids' grades at a local school here in Ra'anana. She is from Ra'anana. So it's a very personal story for all of us. She's in Israel. She's still in the hospital, not back yet in Ra'anana, but that's huge news. And I'll of course talk about this. But moving forward, I really want to bring you all these other aspects of Israeli life too. There's so much more to Israel than just the headline kind of stuff. And we can often lose sight of just how magical, but also chaotic Israel is if we only pay attention to the headlines. So, going forward, I'm going to start bringing you some different stories about Israel besides just the ones you're seeing in the news. And of course, I'll always touch base about the biggest news stories and take your questions. But it really is important to me that you see some of these different aspects of Israeli life. And why start with tennis? Well, as I said, the Australian Open just finished today. Also, tennis is, after Israel, one of my big passions. I try to play at least 4 or 5 times a week. I'm a 4.0 level player. For those of you out there who know what that means, you know what that means. I'm right-handed, hit with a two-handed backhand. So if I'm on the road in your neighborhood, let's hook up and play a match, play a game. I'm also somewhat of an expert on tennis. I wrote this book. I have 4 books out. 3 of them are connected to Israel. But this book, Essential Tennis, is not connected to Israel. It's about tennis. I wrote it with Coach Ian Westerman out of Milwaukee. And what we really try to do here is break down all the myths about tennis technique and tennis improvement. And it was a great partnership working with Ian. And I learned so much about the game that I never had before by working with him on that book, Essential Tennis. And I think with the open finishing and my passion being tennis, this is a great time to sort of pivot and start talking about some different aspects of Israeli life. And my goal here is to show you why the Israeli approach to tennis is so different from that of other countries. And my thesis is very simple. And I'm going to warn you, it's probably not something you're going to be happy to hear, but it's the truth as I see it nonetheless. My thesis is that it is going to be a really, really long time before an Israeli player wins a major championship. When I say majors, I mean the four majors on the calendar year: Australian Open, French Open, Wimbledon, and the US Open. Not only will it be a long time before an Israeli player wins one of those, I think it'll be a long time before an Israeli goes deep into those finals. Let's say beyond even the second round. And I want to tell you why I think that it'll be so long, perhaps never, that Israel has a Grand Slam finalist or champion. As I said, Israeli players face a series of unique obstacles that tennis players in virtually every other competing country do not face. And I'm going to go through them right now and say a few words about each. And these are not in order. I thought for a moment I'm going to put these obstacles in order, but it's too hard because as you'll see, they all mesh together. So I came up with 6 obstacles to Israeli success in a major way in tennis. Not necessarily in order, but as you'll see, they all kind of fit together. So number 1 is money. It's been estimated that it costs approximately $25,000 to $30,000 a year for a family to put a kid through the proper tennis education so that he or she can compete at a global level in one of the majors. And that would mean breaking into the top 100 and easily qualifying for these opens that I just mentioned. So think about that. 25 to $30,000 a year. I mean, that's what Jewish day school costs back in Westchester when I was living there. And that's a formidable sum of money for anyone, but especially in Israel, where salaries are so much lower than they are relative to the US or Canada or the UK. Doctors in Israel will often make in the, 60, $70,000 a year range maximum, as opposed to what doctors make in the US. Lawyers, pretty much the same. It's significantly lower here. Plus, the taxes are very, very high. If you're in the highest income bracket in Israel, you're paying about 50% or more, the over 50% in taxes. And there's various reasons for that. Our need to support the military, socialized medicine, um, just the general welfare system that Israel has. Israel does have a pretty strong and good welfare system. But the fact of the matter is, there are not many families in Israel who can afford $25,000 to $30,000 a year to put a kid through proper tennis training. So that's number 1. Number 2, even if they could afford that, Israel does not have the infrastructure. And I mean literally the number of tennis courts, or the more metaphorically, the academies, the psychology necessary to send a kid through this kind of tennis education. Spain has this. There's the Rafael Nadal Academy, the several other tennis academies. Players all over the world will go to Spain to train and live year round. Israel does not have that kind of infrastructure. So even if a family had $30,000 a year to put behind their child's tennis education, we don't have an academy here where they could get the kind of training they need. And it's not just that they do academic school along with tennis training. These academies in Spain, they really create the holistic tennis player. So it's not just your on court, your strokes, it's your strategy, it's your physical fitness, it's the mental approach to the game. So students in Spain are spending, hours and hours a day, maybe 12 hours a day on tennis related improvement. That kind of infrastructure does not exist in Israel. And when I say infrastructure, that also means just the equipment, down to the balls. I remember I had an episode recently where I was taking lessons with a coach here in Israel, and he's from Argentina. He's one of the better coaches. And he was training one of the male players who was about 16 at the time for an upcoming trip to the US Open to try to qualify for the US Open. And he went to the tennis office to get balls. Now, let's say in Austria, Dominic Thiem, who just announced his retirement recently. One of my Israeli hitting partners here used to play with Dominic Thiem in Austria. They would train together. And he said that Thiem's father would come out with a shopping cart filled with balls. Like, imagine a shopping cart from the grocery store filled with tennis balls. And these were new balls, and they would hit through these forehand after forehand after forehand for hours and hours each day. Well, this tennis coach in Israel, who was preparing the Israeli player for an upcoming trip to the US Open qualifiers, was given a can of 3 balls. That's right. He was provided one can with 3 balls to train his player for that day. And the coach was furious because there's really no way you can run a good practice session with only 3 balls. But again, it's because we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the money, not only on the family level, but on the national level to put behind the kind of serious training you would need. Okay. Number 2, even if we had families with the money and the training academies, the fact of the matter is our population is way too small to produce the kind of outlier, the kind of phenomenon that you need in order to send a player to one of these majors. I mentioned Spain before and these academies. The best known Spanish tennis player in the world right now is Alcaraz out of Spain, who was beaten by Djokovic in the quarterfinals. And it's kind of sad because it was a great match, and then Djokovic ultimately pulled out of his semifinal match with Zverev. In any case, Alcaraz is an outlier. He is at the extreme end of the bell curve. So for every Alcaraz, you've got thousands of awesome Spanish players who just never make it quite that far. But the reason you can have that Alcaraz, that outlier at the far end of the bell curve, is because you have this huge population of tennis players where one of them can make it and go all the way Alcaraz has. Israel does not have that kind of population. Our population is small in general, 10 million. The population that plays sports at this kind of high level is even smaller. And the percentage of the population that plays tennis is probably tiniest of all because it is such an expensive sport and takes up so much time and land. In a soccer team, during a soccer game, you can have 22 great players on the field, right? I'm not a big soccer player. I think it's 11 per side. In tennis, at the most, you can have 4 on court at a time if you're playing doubles. And that tennis court takes up as much space as a basketball court, which would, obviously field 10 at a time, but you only have 4 or 2 if it's singled. So we just don't have big enough population to be able to produce that outlier at the far end of the bell curve. So that's number 3. Number 4 is the army. The fact is, at the age of 18, all Israelis, except the ultra-Orthodox, who are not playing tennis anyway, are going to the army. Now, there is such a thing it's called sportai mitzdayen in Israel, that if you are really an elite athlete, you can get a pass from the government that you either don't have to do your army service at all, or you do a very minimal army service. There was one tennis player I was training with here uh, who got a sportai mitzdayen grant, but he still had to put on a uniform. He still had to go to an army base 3 times a week. I think his job was to like raise the flag in the morning or maybe mop the kitchen floor twice a week or some really small and minimal effort job. But he still had to put on that uniform and show up at the base and check in. And that was time that he couldn't put into his army. That's time that he couldn't put into his tennis training. And then there are those who, despite the fact that they could qualify for this athletic exemption, they turn it down. I mentioned before my friend Omer. I didn't name him, but his name is Omer, and he was one of Israel's top players. He was the number one teenage player in Israel at one time. Before going to the army, he went to train with Dominic Thiem in Austria. But when it came time to do the army, instead of trying for the athletic exemption, he actually chose to do his military service as a source of pride. He didn't want to go his whole life not having served in the army. And a lot of players at a high level are like that. Think about the mentality it takes to be a great athlete. That kind of mentality is the same one that drives you to serve in the army, and not only to serve in the army, but to serve in the most elite unit possible. My friend Omer, who, by the way, I'm still in touch with, and I did a podcast episode on him. His unit, he was in Maglan, which is a very elite unit. His unit was the second one in Gaza. I believe he gave me the date, but it was a week or maybe a week after October 7th of 23. His unit was in Gaza on the ground. He was there. And I did a podcast episode about the coffee I had with him where he told me what it was like being in Gaza in those early stages. But in any case, here was Omer, who a couple of years ago was training with Dominic Thiem, who won the U.S. Open. And a few years later, he's on his belly avoiding Hamas gunfire in Gaza. So that's another big factor as well, is that the best of our best often choose to do the army, and they have their athletic training interrupted because of their service in the IDF. Now, on that note, it just reminded me of one more thing. I mentioned that we have a small population and that the ultra Orthodox doesn't serve in the army. However, there are modern Orthodox tennis players in Israel, but eventually they fall out of the system because all major tennis tournaments in Israel take place on the weekends. They'll usually start on a Sunday, but then by Thursday, that's when the semifinals happen. And Friday is the second round of semifinals. And then the finals will be on a Saturday, on Shabbat. And so Orthodox players cannot play in the finals. And all the big tournaments in Israel, there's the Sukkot tournament, the Pesach tournament. But Orthodox players will not play on the Chagim, on the high holidays themselves. And so they necessarily are weeded out of the system. So our small population becomes even smaller. So those are the first four: money, the lack of infrastructure and academies, the small population, and army service. Okay, so two more. Number 5 is coaching. Look, I love Israelis. I couldn't live in Israel if I didn't. I'm married to an Israeli. My kids are Israeli. I've taken tennis lessons with a lot of Israeli coaches, and I gotta say, for the most part, I'm not really impressed. There seems to be a very Israeli attitude toward the coaching, which is kind of do the minimum, check in, check out, don't really go above and beyond. There is sort of we live in a society here in Israel where jobs are often protected. It's very hard to get fired from a lot of jobs here in Israel. And because of that, the work ethic isn't always as high as it should be. And this isn't just when I've had my own lessons with Israeli coaches. I've watched Israeli coaches coaching their players. And you'll see them, while their players are training, you'll see their coaches go over and get on their cell phones and check messages or make phone calls. And I can compare that because of my work on this book. I got a deep dive into tennis coaching, not just in the US, but in other places around the world. And it's much more rigorous and much more intense in other countries. And the coaches are much more dedicated. There's a phrase in Israel, it's a dirty expression, Zrikat Zayin, which means to toss your penis, toss your dick. Doesn't mean it means you don't give a damn. You don't give it your all. And there is a little bit of a Zrikat Zayin attitude among some of the coaches here in Israel. They're certainly happy to take your money when they're coaching you, but as someone who knows how to coach and what it's like to coach, and I've coached myself because even though I'm only a 4.0 level player, I know how to teach the game very well. A lot of the coaches here just kind of phone it in and they do the minimum. And you don't have those really awesome. I mean, I'm sure there are a few, but I haven't met the really awesome coaches who take that holistic approach to the game and give their all so that their players can succeed to the best of their ability. I know it's probably not hearing that because we love Israelis and we want to love them, in their entirety. But in this case, that's the hard truth as I see it. Okay. So here's number 6. Number 6, the final obstacle, is the Israeli attitude overall. And by that, I mean not only the coaches, but also the parents and the players. You know, to be a great tennis player, you have to be humble, or at least humble enough to take instruction from your coach. And players' parents, the parents of these players, have to be humble enough to turn over their children to the coach and say, "Coach, you know best." And Israeli players and parents are not like that. You know, Israelis in general, it's very hard for them to admit that someone else knows better than them and that they are not the expert in a certain area. It's part of the reason we love Israelis is all their bravado and their chutzpah. But it makes it very hard to coach a player when that player doesn't necessarily want to show up on time or doesn't want to do the running. You know, I've watched Israeli players. Most of the big tournaments and a lot of the training takes place right here in Ra'anana, where I live. And when I go out for my own hitting sessions, I'll stick around and I'll watch the practices with the kids, the teens, and so many of them are just half-assing it and phoning it in and, giving 60%, but not that 100%. Or when the coach isn't looking, they might stop doing their physical exercises and then start again when the coach turns around. There's not that drive to be the best that you will see at these academies in Spain, and the US, like at IMG or other places. And along with that is the parents. You'll have parents telling the coaches, "Well, you're working my kid too hard," or "My kid needs a day off. I'm pulling him out of practice today," or "We're going on family vacation, so he's going to skip a week of practice," which I'm not saying is wrong. I mean, families need their vacations, but to be a champion tennis player, you need to be all in and then some. You can't just be 80% in or 90 or mostly in. You've got to be obsessive about it and you've got to allow it to take over your life and you've got to allow yourself to have your life be controlled by this other person, the coach and the coaching team. And that just goes against the Israeli attitude of I'm in charge. I know best. No one tells me what to do. And that's hard for coaches as well. And I know this firsthand by talking to coaches about their experiences here. That one coach I mentioned before, the one who was given only a can with 3 balls in it to train the player, he's originally from Argentina, and he's having a very hard time because he's used to the Spanish style of tennis, the rigorous training. Tennis is a below the waist sport. People think of racket head speed and the strokes, but mostly tennis is footwork and movement. And so in these Spanish programs, if you want to know why men's tennis, in the US has not produced a champion since Roddick, it's because America is way too focused on the upper body and our European counterparts, especially in Spain, Argentina, the clay court countries, they're they focus on the lower body, footwork, movement, and In Israel, that kind of non-tennis, non non-identifiable tennis training. It's very easy to identify tennis with a racket and a ball, but once you start running wind sprints and doing movement drills, that's a little less tennis related, it seems, and less fun. Players tend to check out, and that's another reason why. It's that Israeli attitude toward the holistic approach and putting your career into somebody else's hands. So those are the 6 reasons why I think that, it's gonna be a long time, if ever, before Israel ever produces a Grand Slam finalist and even further, a champion. Money, lack of infrastructure and academies, the small population, the army, coaching, and generally the Israeli attitude. So where do we stand right now in terms of Israeli tennis? On a social level, I'll just tell you what tennis is like here in Israel. So far, pickleball has not really hit Israel. Between you and me, I would say thank God. As a tennis player, it's sort of sad. I'm a little bit sad to see how all of our courts in America are being taken over by pickleball. At the same time, I understand why. Pickleball is a much quicker sport. It takes up much less space. It's much more social. I think best of all, you can show up at a pickleball court with just your paddle and find a game. You can't do that in tennis. You can't just show up at the tennis courts hoping to find someone. But in pickleball, you can show up alone, and within 15 minutes, 20 minutes, you'll be in a game, and the games move quickly, and there's a great social scene attached to it. In any case, pickleball hasn't really hit Israel. So our tennis courts still are tennis courts, but there really are no public tennis courts in Israel. There's really no such thing as a tennis court where you just walk on and play. They're only part of clubs. Now, these clubs are not really expensive. It usually costs about $8 an hour per person to play, which I don't consider that expensive. That's actually cheaper than it is in the US. But in the US, you have free courts. I'm thinking of where I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and there were free courts everywhere. Just about every park had a playground for kids and a basketball court and 1 or 2 tennis courts, and you could just walk on and play if it was empty. That does not exist in Israel. There are no free public courts. You either have to join that club as a member or pay the hourly fee. So there's just not there's really a lack of availability. And there aren't that many. Ra'anana has quite a few because we're sort of more of an upscale town, but there are many towns that don't have any tennis at all. So it's not a by any means a huge sport here in Israel on a social level. And the expense, as I mentioned before, is another reason for that. So where do we stand in terms of the elite players? Well, so the bad news, like I said, is that I don't see an Israeli player making it deep into one of these tournaments for a long time. But the good news is we have more and more Israeli players who are going to college in the U.S. On scholarships. We have a guy I used to coach with, who used to coach me here. He has one of his students who's going to, I believe, Vanderbilt next fall. I used to hit with a player who is now at University of South Carolina, and we have a player at University of Miami in Florida. And so that's sort of the dream right now. When Israeli players get to a high enough level, they really aren't talking about making it to the US Open or Wimbledon. I think for them, they know it's much more realistic and probably better for their life overall if they can get a 4-year scholarship to an American university. So wherever you are, if you're in a college town with a good college scene, look up the roster. It could be you've got an Israeli player on that roster. Maybe go say hi, take them out to lunch. They'd probably love it. But more and more, we do have Israeli players going the 4-year college route in the U.S. And then we do have a few who are making it to these big tournaments, but they usually tend to lose very early. As I mentioned, we had Lena Glushko, who just played at the Australian Open. She did not qualify for the main draw, so she had to play what's called the qualies, the qualifying rounds. If she got past that qualifying round, she would then get into the main draw, but she lost in the qualies as well to a French player. But we're proud with her nonetheless, and I've actually been in touch with her. She has agreed to be a guest on a future episode of Inside Israel. She's on a series of tournaments in Europe right now. But when she gets back, hopefully I'll sit down with her and talk to her firsthand about her Australian Open experience. And in particular, the story where she was not allowed to wear a yellow hostage pin onto court at the Australian Open because that was a political statement, which is such utter bullshit. I can't believe it. But she did tie a yellow ribbon in her hair around her ponytail in the exact shape of the hostage commemoration ribbon. So good for her for doing that. And we'll talk about that when she is able to come on the pod. Okay. Quick pivot now to the news this week. Obviously, the big news is the release of 4 more hostages. Naama, who is right from Ra'anana, right here in our neighborhood. Liri, Karina, and Danielle, they were all released yesterday. I'm sure you saw the big ceremony that Hamas put on, trying to make it seem like they were graciously and beautifully sending off these 4 guests. That's right, guests, complete with gift bags. I don't know if you saw this, but all the hostages released last week and this week were given a little gift bag from Hamas with mementos from their stay, including photographs from their time in captivity and a certificate saying that they'd completed whatever it is they completed, or thanking them for completing their captivity. Again, it shows you the psychological warfare that our enemy is using against us, but not successfully. You saw these 4 hostages, these 4 freed captives, these young women on stage, smiling and giving thumbs up and refusing to be humiliated in front of these crowds of Hamas and Gazans. So good for them. And this has really become an emotional roller coaster for all of us here in Israel. Every Saturday they're releasing hostages for the next now 5. And so we have this huge emotional high on Saturday, and then Sunday hits, and we start waiting for the next week. Who's going to be on the list? We have this controversy now because the ceasefire called for women and children to be released first. And we still have a number of women who have not been released. Before these 4 young women from the last weekend, they were all soldiers. They were supposed to be in the next round. We still have Arbel Yehud and Shiri Bibas who have not been released. And so there's actually talks right now that Yehud Arbel might be released during the week. She's being held by Islamic Jihad, not Hamas. That's why it's a little more complicated. But Israel is not allowing Gazans to return to the north of Gaza until she is released. And I commend the government for doing that. We cannot let Hamas play with us and call the shots here. But I do want to note that the psychology of Israelis is very tenuous right now. Going from Saturday to Saturday, seeing some hostages released, but not all, wondering who's going to be released next. We feel like we're being played with as well. There's also been a lot of talk in Israel about respecting the privacy of the released hostages and the media not showing too many pictures of them and shoving cameras in their faces. And I totally get it. And we need to do that. We need to respect their privacy. At the same time, I want to stick up for the Israeli population. It's been harrowing these past 15 months, seeing our children, our siblings, our grandparents and parents being held hostage. We need to see the images of the hostages embracing their mothers and fathers. We need to see the images of the IDF hugging these hostages as they are finally released from the Red Cross. We need that to heal our own souls. So as much as I know that it's important to respect their privacy, it's a disservice to Israelis if we don't at least get to see some of that, because through their families hugging them, we vicariously are hugging them as well. And we need that sense of closure after all we've been through. I just want to stick up for the population because that side of the argument really isn't being talked about. We had quite a few comments and questions come in this week. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them because I'm actually doing an online session with a group of Jewish teens in about 10 minutes. I want to take one comment, and I'll have to save the rest for next week. Maybe next week I'll begin with the questions and comments. How about that? So this one person wrote in, I believe his name is Sam. He said, in your last podcast, you mentioned how HUC, the Reform Rabbinical College is closing its location in Cincinnati. The biggest issue I see with American Jewry, he writes, is the insane cost of being a Jew. Jewish day school is $20,000 to $40,000 per kid, shul membership, a few grand, constant fundraisers, kosher food, double or triple the price of treif, the B'nai Mitzvah, summer camp. You essentially have to be an extremely rich, upper middle class, or even upper class person to be a Jew in America. And he lists a few other things. And I just want to respond that I agree 100%. This is a huge problem, not just in America, but in other Jewish countries. But because I'm from the US and I raised kids in the US and sent them to Jewish day school and summer camps, it takes over your life. And I'm going to take one step further. The Jewish community as a whole in the United States, I feel, is mismanaging this problem. There needs to be some sort of collective fund where we can together send kids to camp, which is the number one way of keeping kids Jewish, and send them to day school. You can say what you want about birthright. We have funneled millions and millions of dollars into birthright, bringing kids to Israel for 10 days on a free trip. Whether it's good or not, I'm still on the fence. I don't know how much it actually pays off in the end. I would rather see that money, or at least a lot of it, go to the younger ages. So we don't have to send them to Israel for 10 days as an emergency last ditch effort. But instead, we can nurture them with a Jewish education that's meaningful from kindergarten on. But yes, I think this writer, Sam, his point in writing this email to me was that, well, he concludes by saying this: while yes, living in Israel is insanely expensive, being Jewish in America is insanely expensive as well. That was his point. And I got to agree with you. We did not move to Israel 9 years ago because we would save money living here. We moved here for ideological reasons because we'd always wanted to, and Dorit is from here, and we wanted our kids to do the army. But it has occurred to me that as much as I complain and bitch and moan about the cost of life in Israel, it actually is cheaper than Jewish life in America. Because as I said, there was one year where I was sending all four of my kids to Jewish day school. And yeah, we got some scholarship money, but even some scholarship money on 4 day school educations, that's still going to be quite a lot that you're going to pay. And we sent them to summer camp and joined synagogue and kept kosher. So when you add it all up, yeah, it actually can be a cost-effective move to raise your family Jewishly in Israel. And I remind people that because they're always wary about the how their standard of living is going to go down when they move here. And in many ways it will. You know, we went from a house to an apartment, from 2 cars to 1, but we're not paying for medical care virtually at all because the socialized medicine, I got to say, it's pretty good here. We're not paying day school tuition. We are not paying some of these other, synagogue memberships and other costs that simply, add up. And I'm not going to a bunch of fundraisers either. So at the end of the day, it can even out or even be cheaper to raise your Jewish family here in Israel. Maybe that's too long of a slogan to fit on a T-shirt to get people to make Aliyah, but it's true nonetheless. Next week, I will begin with your questions and comments so we can make sure we get that in. And speaking of next week, I'm flying on next Sunday. I'm going to be in the U.S. From this Thursday on in Teaneck, New Jersey next Saturday night, and then in Fort Lauderdale and Boca on the Sunday the 9th, I believe it is. So if you're in those areas, come say hi. Those events are on my website. But next Sunday, I do anticipate that the pod will happen at, let's say, 8 p.m. Eastern time. I should be grounded and landed by then in Texas to do that at 8 p.m. Eastern. But stay tuned this Thursday in the newsletter. I will announce the exact time and send out the link for the YouTube live that I will be doing. Again, that's next Sunday, February 2nd, probably 8 or 9 p.m. Eastern time. Any other questions, please reach out to me. You can always reach me through the website, joelchasnoff.com. Sign up for the newsletter at the bottom. You can email me there, podcast info on the podcast page. Really looking forward to seeing all of you next week. Signing off from Ra'anana, Israel. Thanks for joining me on Inside Israel. Lehitraot. Be well, everyone.